Japanese pilots called it the whistling death. When they heard that sound, they knew they were already too late. This wasn't just another American fighter. It was the plane that flipped Pacific Air combat upside down. A single Corsair could shred an entire formation before they even knew it was there. Japanese aces believed they ruled the sky until this blue monster started hunting them. It was faster, deadlier, and climbed like nothing Japan had ever seen. And the scariest part? The Corsair kept getting better every month. Early 1943. Clouds over the Solomons drift apart, and suddenly a dark blue gull-wing silhouette drops out of the sky. Japanese pilots expected slow Wildcats. Instead, the Corsair dove in at more than 400 miles per hour, so fast that half the formation didn't even register what hit them. Explosions lit the air as tracers tore through zeros. Survivors described it simply: "We never saw the attacker, only the dead aircraft." The bent wings confused everyone. Pilots thought it was experimental or broken. But those inverted gull wings were the key to fitting the biggest radial engine the US had ever put on a fighter. Nothing in the Japanese arsenal, not the Zero, not the Oscar, had the power to compete. The moment Japanese pilots recognized that silhouette, they radioed warnings: "New enemy plane, avoid close engagement." Japanese pilots gave it the nickname Kusatsu no Shur, the whistling death. When the Corsair dove, wind screamed through wing root intakes, producing a chilling whine. Even veteran Japanese aces admitted the sound made them flinch. They knew if they heard the whistle, they were already within firing range. And no Zero could outrun a Corsair diving at full speed. Inside was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp 2000 plus horsepower of raw violence. Japanese aircraft ran on small, fragile engines built for lightweight turning fights. But the Corsair wasn't playing that game. It was a heavyweight boxer entering a knife fight. It climbed faster, hit harder, and could simply power straight out of danger. Japanese pilots wrote in reports, "This aircraft climbs like a rocket." This is where panic really started. Japanese fighters were designed for agility, not survival. A Zero shot once or twice could explode or catch fire. But Corsairs? They often came home with wings torn, nose panels shredded, oil leaking, hydraulics gone, but the pilot was alive. One Japanese ace described firing a full burst into a Corsair, watching pieces fly off, and yet it kept climbing. That moment broke morale. They realized their guns weren't enough. Zero pilots tried the same escape maneuver they always used: break contact, push the nose down, and dive away. It worked against Wildcats. It worked against P-40s. But the first time they tried it against a Corsair, they realized they had made a fatal mistake. The Corsair stayed stable at over 500 miles per hour. Japanese fighters shook, wings fluttered, controls locked, and some simply tore apart. The Corsair? It dropped like a hammer, steady, accurate, closing the distance like a predator. Pilots said it felt like a beast falling from the sky. Japanese pilots believed the Zero was unmatched in close-in turning battles. But Corsair pilots didn't play that game. Instead, they used high-speed barrel rolls and slashing hit-and-run passes. The Corsair didn't turn with you. It outmaneuvered you with raw power. Japanese aces described watching the Corsair flip inverted, dive, vanish, then reappear behind them. They called it a heavy plane that moved like a small one. They simply didn't understand how something that big could roll that fast. Japanese pilots preferred dusk attacks, until Corsair night fighters appeared. Painted dark blue, the Corsair blended into the sky so perfectly that pilots couldn't see it even at 200 meters. And now Corsairs had radar. They climbed silently, approached unseen, and fired before the Japanese even realized a fight had begun. One Japanese pilot wrote in his diary, "The darkness belongs to America now. We are hunted from the shadows." When reports came in about Marine pilot Kenneth Walsh, Japanese intelligence grew alarmed. Walsh shot down multiple aircraft even while outnumbered 6-1. And when he returned, his Corsair was full of holes, but flying perfectly. Japanese command sent out warnings. Avoid the bent wing fighter unless you have advantage. But nobody had advantage. Not against Walsh. Not against the Corsair. The Corsair hit speeds above 400 miles per hour faster than anything Japan could put in the air in 1943. Zeros tried climbing. Corsairs climbed faster. They tried diving. Corsairs dove faster. They tried running level. Corsairs closed the distance in seconds. A Japanese pilot who survived described it simply: "It looked large, but it moved like lightning. The Corsair carried 6.50 cal Browning machine guns, a wall of firepower the Japanese were never prepared for. A 2-second burst threw out more than 700 rounds of armor-piercing lead. Zeros, with their paper-thin frames and unprotected fuel tanks, simply disintegrated. Pilots reported wings ripping off, engines exploding, and planes bursting into flames instantly. One Japanese survivor said, "The Corsair did not fire bullets. It fired holes." Japanese pilots were trained to fight in tight groups for protection. That tactic worked until the Corsair showed up. Its heavy guns didn't just kill one plane. They tore holes through 2 aircraft if they were lined up. In multiple engagements over Bougainville, Corsair pilots shredded entire formations with one diving pass. What Japanese pilots thought was safety in numbers became a death trap. They began spreading out, but that made them even easier targets. The turning point came over Rabaul, Japan's most fortified stronghold. Corsairs dove in wave after wave, their blue paint almost glowing in the sun. Despite being outnumbered, they dominated the air with brutal efficiency. Japanese officers watching from the ground reported, "Our fighters rose to meet them and did not return." The psychological impact was devastating. Rabaul was supposed to be safe. The Corsair made it a slaughterhouse. By late 1944, Japan relied on kamikaze attacks, fast, desperate, unstoppable. At least, until the Corsair began intercepting them. Its climb rate and raw power allowed it to reach suicide planes before they came close to Allied ships. Corsair pilots shot them down with terrifying consistency. Japanese commanders wrote bitterly that, "Corsairs hunt our divine wind like insects." Even a mission designed to guarantee death suddenly had a new enemy. When Japanese pilots somehow lined up a shot, their bullets still weren't enough. The Corsair cockpit had armored plates, bullet-resistant glass, and a massive radial engine acting like a shield. Pilots returned with windshields cracked, wings shredded, and holes everywhere, but alive. Meanwhile, Japanese fighters couldn't take even a few hits without burning. Survivors admitted, "The American plane survives what would kill 10 of ours." That realization changed everything. Fear replaced confidence. Japanese intelligence officers gathered combat reports from the Solomons and Bougainville. What they saw terrified them. Corsair engagements almost always ended with American pilots surviving and Japanese planes burning. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Zeros could win turning fights, but Corsairs didn't turn fight. They smashed through, climbed out, turned around, and came back with even more speed. One officer wrote, "This airplane does not fight our way. It creates its own war." Pilots admitted something unusual. The Corsair looked scary. The bent wings made it appear larger than it was, especially when diving straight at you. Japanese aviators said the silhouette reminded them of a bird of prey folding its wings before striking. That image, dark blue, screaming whistle, nose pointed down, created fear before the guns even fired. Even experienced aces described a moment of hesitation. And in air combat, hesitation is death. Reports spread fast in Japanese circles about Corsairs surviving impossible damage. One story claimed a Corsair returned with half its tail blown apart. Another survived a full head-on collision and still landed. Japanese pilots began believing the aircraft was too strong to kill. That wasn't true, of course, but the belief mattered more. Morale dropped. Pilots facing Corsairs assumed they wouldn't survive. And a pilot who thinks he's already dead can't win. Once Marine squadrons switched fully to Corsairs, the entire air war changed. They swept Japanese bombers from the sky. They cleared airfields. They destroyed supply convoys. They intercepted kamikazes before they reached the fleet. The Japanese territorial map began shrinking fast, not because of one plane alone, but because the Corsair gave the US complete air control. It wasn't domination. It was erasure. Corsairs didn't only fight in the sky, they attacked ships and airfields at terrifyingly low altitudes. Screenshots from gun cameras showed Corsairs skimming treetops, firing rockets, and pulling away just meters above the water. Japanese soldiers on the ground described the sound as a roaring demon. Even hardened anti-air crews ducked for cover. The Corsair's speed, firepower, and armor made low-level strikes suicidal to defend against. It wasn't just feared by pilots. It was feared by everyone who saw it. During the Solomon Islands campaign, Corsair pilots learned a deadly new tactic. A high-speed slashing attack from above. One Marine pilot dove through a Japanese formation at over 380 miles per hour, fired a single 2-second burst, and watched 4 Zeros erupt into flames one after another. He never turned, never clawed, never lost speed. Japanese pilots were stunned. They had never seen an American aircraft capable of wiping out a squadron without engaging in a turning fight. For them, this was a new kind of war, one they were losing fast. For years, the A6M0 dominated the Pacific. Lightweight, agile, deadly at low speed. But the Corsair exposed its weaknesses instantly. The Zero had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no safety margin at high speed. Against the Corsair's brute strength and superior firepower, the Zero's advantages evaporated. Japanese pilots realized something devastating. Their legendary fighter, once feared across the Pacific, had just been outclassed by a machine they couldn't outturn, outclimb, or outdive. The Zero's reign was over. The VMF squadrons, especially VMF 214, the Black Sheep, turned the Corsair into a legend. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington and his men roamed the skies like hunters, attacking from angles the Japanese had never trained to defend. They didn't just shoot down enemy aircraft. They shattered entire wings, forced emergency landings, and wrecked morale across multiple bases. Japanese pilots began reporting, "Black Corsairs are in the area. Avoid combat. When the enemy starts avoiding you, you own the sky." To stop the Corsair's dominance, Japanese command organized an ambush near Bougainville. A group of elite Zeros hid above the clouds, waiting for Corsairs to climb into their trap. But the plan collapsed instantly. Corsairs used their insane climb rate to reach the ambush altitude. Before the Zeros were even in position, the hunters became the hunted. Within minutes, multiple Japanese fighters were spiraling down in smoke. The ambush taught Japan a brutal lesson. You cannot trap an aircraft that climbs faster than your fighters can take off. On Pacific Islands, soldiers on the ground could identify aircraft without seeing them. Zeros had a high, thin buzz. Dauntless dive bombers screamed. But the Corsair had a deep, violent roar followed by its iconic whistle. Marines said the sound meant safety. Air support had arrived. Japanese troops, on the other hand, wrote that hearing the Corsair's engine meant incoming death from above. That sound became a psychological weapon, the battlefield noise that lifted American spirits and froze Japanese hearts. In the early months, the Corsair had one serious weakness. It was hard to land. Its long nose made forward visibility terrible on approach. Carrier pilots bounced, skidded, even crashed. The Japanese heard rumors. America has built a fighter too dangerous to fly. But Marines didn't quit. They retrained, changed approach angles, adjusted glide paths. And soon they were landing Corsairs with confidence. Once solved, the landing issue became a symbol of the aircraft itself. Tough, unforgiving, and worth mastering. A plane that punished the weak and rewarded the fearless. As the war dragged on, Japan rushed new aircraft into service. The Ki-61, the Ki-84, and improved Zero models. They hoped something, anything, could challenge the Corsair. But shortages of fuel, parts, engines, and trained pilots turned every new fighter into a shadow of its design. Meanwhile, Corsairs kept getting upgrades. Better engines, better rocket rails, better gun sights. The gap widened every month. The Japanese were fighting with prototypes. America was fighting with perfected steel. It wasn't a contest. It was a collapse. By late 1945, air combat was rare. Japan's veteran pilots were gone. America owned the sky. But the few remaining dogfights show exactly why the Corsair became legendary. Corsairs intercepted bombers, swatted down desperate attacks, and patrolled skies with near impunity. Many Japanese pilots never even saw the Corsair that shot them down. The war that began with Zero dominance ended with the Corsair circling above empty skies, because there was simply nothing left to fight. When World War II ended, most fighters were retired. Not the Corsair. It was too powerful, too reliable, too deadly to abandon. It went on to fight in Korea, 10 years after its first missions, shooting down jets despite being a propeller-driven aircraft. The Japanese once feared it. Now the entire world respected it. The Corsair wasn't just a World War II plane. It was a machine built beyond its time. A monster of steel and sound that shaped two wars and defined a generation of air combat. The Japanese nicknamed it the Whistling Death. American pilots called it the greatest fighter ever built. But history remembers it for one simple reason. It changed the Pacific War. It outclimbed, outran, outfought, and outsurvived everything Japan put into the air. And long after the smoke cleared, the roar of its engine remained. A reminder that sometimes a single aircraft can decide the fate of an entire ocean. If you want more forgotten Pacific stories, hit like, subscribe, and join me on the next mission. This was the story of the F4U Corsair, and why Japanese pilots feared it.